Okie doke. Okay, so welcome everybody. This is the last week of last full week of FEWD. It's very sad, but hopefully you felt like it's been a good journey. I have. Geez, I've already messed this up. No. They fixed this thing in the wall, and I think I just broke it. So. We'll try to jump start it. Oh, here we go. That's so in any case, we finished all of the curriculum material at this point, and today's class we're going to do a bit of review, finish some of the stuff we were talking about last class, and then we're going to go into some of the questions that have been consistently asked of me and TAs throughout the course. That aren't strictly related to what we do in class, but are practical skills that we might need, namely hosting. Like, how do I get these sites online, and what are the options there, and what how do I approach that decision and start thinking about that stuff. Then finally, I'm going to go through some material. Where do you go from here, right? So now we've got all these FEWD skills, but there's a vast landscape out there and many potential paths that you could take from here. And so I'll go through some of those options. I'm going to oversimplify things a bit, into sort of kind of these categories that may or may not reflect what the actual paths are, but they kind of show you the spectrum of potentials. So that's what's on the agenda today. Here's the loose agenda, basically what I just said. So this weekend, space news, just because, it's been a very exciting week in space, so I feel like I need to share. One interesting thing that happened was the Kepler-2 spacecraft, which is currently 75 million miles away from the Earth, went into emergency mode for about half of a day. We think that probably it got turned a little bit so that its antenna was not quite facing the Milky Way like it should have been. But luckily, about 14 or 15 hours later, it was back in the right position, and now it's operating normally. But the far more exciting thing that happened was this. So if you haven't seen this already, then you're in for a real treat. So here we go. So that is the Falcon 9 SpaceX ship's first stage rocket. After it deployed its cargo into space, it came back down and landed on a drone ship in the middle of the ocean. For the first time ever, this has happened. So they were able to do this once before on land, but this takes up significantly less fuel to do. It's much cheaper. So if they can continue to do this, this can change space travel forever in a huge way. So it's very exciting. Okay, now we have a guest who wants to give us a quick pitch. So go ahead and introduce yourself.
Can I borrow your little?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Hi everyone, how are y'all doing? All right, great. Thank you, Jake, for letting me interrupt you.
No problem.
I am Laura Jacobson, by the way. I work here at General Assembly. I'm one of the part-time program producers. I do basically Tim's job, but for all the design and business classes. So if you see me around campus, say hey. And I am also really involved with an organization here in DC called Women Who Code. So if you are all familiar with this, Women Who Code is the largest women in tech organization in DC, over 3,500 women strong. I'm actually the organizer for the Women Who Code hackathon this year, which is our first ever hackathon. So sorry, gentlemen, this isn't going to be for you, but there will be one portion of it that will be for you. So I'll mention that at the end. Basically, it's Women Who Code's 2-year anniversary in the city, and we decided that we wanted to celebrate by holding an all-female hackathon. The hackathon is going to be held on the 30th of April and the 1st of May. So that's a Saturday and a Sunday. You can come to one or both of the days. We'd love to have you at both of them. I'll kind of explain the process of how this is going to work. But basically, one of the reasons that I want to come in and talk to you all about this today is that I think that General Assembly students would be a great group of people to have at the hackathon, because you all are currently learning to code, are super passionate about like the projects that you're working on in class, and it's a great opportunity to not only meet other people and get feedback on your projects, but also kind of get to see what else is out there. If you're really interested in hacking in a different language or just jumping into a project head first, this is kind of the day to do it. Just by a show of hands, have any of you ever been to a hackathon before? Okay, one person, 2 people. Okay, so 3 people. All right. Hackathons are awesome, and this is part of the reason why I really wanted to host one, is that there's such a great opportunity for especially newbies to get exposed to a lot in the coding community very, very quickly. And that's really been one of my goals with this hackathon, is to try and get people who are learning to get as much experience doing as much as they can in the hackathon. So I've been setting up all the teams with different mentors. We're going to have Women Who Code leadership on around the entire course of the day, really helping people and trying to facilitate building really good projects. So I'm going to scroll down a little bit. We have the locations for the hackathon. So day 1, April 30th, is going to be at Social Tables, and that's the main hacking day. The event is completely free, so you just have to sign up for a ticket on Eventbrite. We're going to be having free breakfast, free lunch, free coffee, all that good stuff. Some really cool swag as well. You come in, and there's already some projects that are milling around. I'll show you a little bit more about that later. Basically, you can come in with a project idea or not come in with a project idea and just join a team, and then basically work on that project during the day. You have most of the day. You can either go home and work on it a little bit more, or just say, hey, I did what I could, finish the project, and then we'll come back the next day. And at the Iron Yard, we're going to be doing our presentation fair. And so the presentation fair is basically going to be everyone setting up their computer with the project they've been working on with their group. They'll be talking about the project, and then we're going to have a group of mentors that are going to be walking around, and these are people who are sponsors of the Women Who Code community, really powerful women in tech in the DC community, Women Who Code leadership, and we're going to be giving out prizes of mentorship. So if you've ever kind of experienced the awkwardness of going up to someone and be like, hey, do I have coffee or something? Can you be my mentor? Super awkward. So we decided to kind of make that process a little bit easier by trying to make the prize mentorship and actually facilitate and build these relationships. The goal is to have everyone come out of this hackathon with a new person that they can go to. And so everyone is basically getting an award out of this. I think it's going to be a really good time. And like I said, I'm really trying. The way I'm building this environment is so that everyone feels really comfortable that they can get involved at any level or capacity that they want to. And then down here in the last part of the invite, we have the project idea page, which if you click on it, we already started to get some ideas building up on here. Basically, if you already have a project idea or maybe a project you're working on for this class, you can put your idea down here. This is actually one of our GATAs for the other FEWD class who put out an idea for a teaching tool. Let's say you're like, hey, that sounds really cool. Actually, I'd be down for that. Put on your name, you can join in on the project, and you already start to kick off the ideas before you even get there. There's also this main page here that's going to be populating with more information about the hackathon. The event page, where is the hackathon projects. There's also going to be an awesome pre-party the Friday before the hackathon. It's going to be at Mapbox, so fellas, you are definitely invited to that. If you want to go, get some free booze, talk to Women Who Code, it's a great time. So that will have some more information linked up there. And the last thing I wanted to show you all, and don't worry about trying to write down the URLs for this because I'm going to have Tim send out the links to all these, is the Slack emails. So Women Who Code, we have our own Slack channel. where you can basically chat about projects, about whatever you want. We have channels for front end, we have channels for data, we have channels for like, pretty much everything, and it's really, really active. And we're going to be using this as a communication tool during the hackathon as well. So, so we can get y'all signed up. And yeah, that's pretty much all I had to say. I know I said a lot of things very quickly. Does anyone have any questions about the hackathon? Yeah.
What happens if we unfortunately can't go to the Saturday session, but you want to go Sunday? Like,
That's fine. It's actually, so there is if you go to the Eventbrite page, there's this thing here that says select a date. You can just do Saturday or Sunday. So you can select one of the days.
But are you missing a lot of like the coding aspects if you only go Sunday?
You're gonna miss the sort of teamwork aspects of it, but I think it would still be beneficial to come on the Sunday if you want to kind of see what other people are doing. You can definitely meet a lot of people that way, and just be able to see kind of what projects are going on and maybe make some connections for working on future projects. Yeah.
I see more events on your website. How do you sign up for them?
Absolutely. So we are always hosting events. We actually host a lab, I guess is what we call them, every night of the week for different languages. The easiest way to sign up for them, go to meetup.com. If you don't have a Meetup account, you make one of those. Most of our events go through Meetup. The only reason we're doing Eventbrite for this is because it's going to be huge and we can't really organize as well with that. Go to the Women Who Code page, and then we have our calendar here with all of the different events you can sign up for. And then you just click, you RSVP for them, and you're good to go. You can also follow us on Twitter. We make announcements about that all the time. I'm actually the person who tweets for Women Who Code, so just be like, hey Lauren, like, can you tell me when this is? And I'll shoot you the information that way too. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you for letting me interrupt you. I'm gonna hand it back over to your lovely instructor. If you have any additional questions, I'll shoot my email address over as well, so you can just shoot me an email or Slack me or something like that. But I would love to see several of you there. I think it would be great to have a good GA contingent there. I think that would be really exciting. Yeah, have a good class.
Cool,
Thank you.
Lauren. Thank you. Sweet. Yeah, many of you have asked me about like how do I continue building these skills, you know, after the class is done, and that is really one great resource. Not just Women Who Code specifically, but there are a lot of meetups in the DC area that are focused on different technologies. There's, you know, a front-end meetup, there's a JavaScript meetup, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, going to meetups, meeting people who are, you know, also learning these skills or using these skills in the professional world, great opportunity to use those things. Tying it back into the slide we were just looking at, when this happened, I had just been at a hackathon. I was up for 24 hours building something at a hackathon, and then I slept for an hour and then woke up to watch this and shed a little tear, but mostly because I was just like sad, tired, and delirious. But yeah, so they're awesome. Definitely go if you can. Okay, so getting back into the stuff. We're going to do a little bit of review. Mostly I'm just going to review the stuff that was new last class, so forms. And then we will jump back into the exercise we started last class and hopefully finish that up. So, so what we're going to do is we're going to just review some of these inputs, and I'm going to ask you guys to help me out. I'm going to show you one, and I'm going to ask each table to kind of tell me what is this input and an example of what kind of user input we might collect with this input. Okay, so first of all, we talked about this one. So can somebody from this table tell me, you know, what is this, and give me an example of something that we might collect with this input?
So it's a text input,
Mm-hmm.
and you can collect a username.
Okay,
or
yeah.
a first name.
Or first name, yeah, exactly. So this is a text input, right? It's just for collecting, you know, any text from a user, any sort of generic text from a user. Commonly, we'll see this used to collect names, usernames, first names, last names, but it could be anything. It could be your address, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Any kind of text. All right. What about this one?
Passwords.
Yeah. Okay. So what makes this one unique, different from the regular text input?
You can mask like what your input is.
Yeah, exactly. The only real difference between this and a regular text input is the fact that this input will sort of mask what you're typing in using those little black circles so that somebody looking over your shoulder can't see it. That's really the only difference. In every other way, it behaves the same as a text input. And what about, oh, here we go. So that's what it would look like when it's all fully fleshed out. What about this one? Yeah. Right, and what might we collect in this one? Exactly, an email address, right? And do you know what makes this one different from a regular text input? Yeah, exactly. Right, the only real difference between this input and a regular text input is that on some mobile devices, using the email type will give it a different keyboard that surfaces things like the @ sign and maybe .com so that it's easier to type in an email address than it would be with a regular keyboard. That's really the only difference. So yeah, exactly. And this is what it might look like fully fleshed out. Okay, so what about this? Now, I know you weren't here last class, right? But do you know what this is? Yeah, okay. And what might this be used to collect?
An input that you have to select one of a few things.
Okay, so maybe an example. Can you think of anything that we might use a radio button for?
What country you're from.
Right, okay, yeah. So what country you're from, right? You're not going to be from multiple countries. You're only going to choose one country. So yeah, we could use a radio button for that. In fact, that's the example I gave. So well done. Okay, cool. And what about this one? And what's this one used to collect? Give me an example.
So it'd be similar to your video, except you can select one checkbox.
Right, so can you think of an example?
Like your favorite of something, you can select multiple. So
Yeah, sure, yeah. If you wanted to select, check all of your favorite foods, right? And there's a list of foods, we could use a checkbox to do that. You could select each one that you liked. Not just one, which is the case with radio buttons. Exactly. This is what it might look like when it's fully fleshed out. Notice for both the radio button and the checkbox, all of the inputs that are part of the same decision have the same name. Okay? So we talked about how name is usually how we identify our inputs on a form. And in the case of a radio button and a checkbox, all of the ones that are part of the same decision share a name, okay? And then they differ in the value, right? So the name here, country, is kind of a label for the question, right? The question of the input that we're trying to get, and the value is the actual user response, right? So here could be one of these three countries. Same for a checkbox, right? These share a name, pets, and the values differ. Okay, and finally this one, we'll swing back into the front. You want to tell me what this one is?
I think that's the drop-down options.
Yeah, it is a drop-down. It's a word we might use to describe this, but typically it's called just a select. Yeah, but it's they're kind of synonymous. And what might we use this for?
It'd be something you'd only select one of. So
Exactly.
male or female.
Okay, yeah, and maybe, so it's very similar to a radio button. In what situation might we use this instead of a radio button?
If you have a lot of options.
Right. Because this kind of collapses all of those options into that select drop-down, we could potentially have a bunch of things we could choose from, and this would be a way not to clutter up our UI, would be to put them all in a select. But it's the same kind of decision. You can pick one of many things. Exactly. So here's what this looks like. We give the select itself a name, and then the options inside of that each have values. Okay. All right, so any questions about the inputs that we've covered? Thank you for everybody that helped out there. So another thing we learned about is some new CSS selectors. Okay, so we've talked about selecting by IDs. We've talked about selecting by classes. We've talked about selecting by divs and using nested selectors, all kinds of stuff. One thing we haven't talked about is this, which is the ability to select by any attribute, any HTML attribute. And most commonly, we'll use this feature in order to select by the name attribute. Okay, because the class attribute, we have the sort of nice syntax of doing dot and then the class name. For ID attributes, you have the nice syntax of doing, hashtag or pound ID name. But for other attributes, we don't have that nice syntax. We use this generic syntax to find something by other attributes. So here we're saying we're looking for all of the elements that have an attribute name with the value username. More commonly, we'll write that like this, which is saying all of the input tags that have an attribute name with the value username. Okay, so this is what we call selector chaining, right? These two things are referring to the same element here. We've just kind of smushed them together to say we want one that's both this and this. Okay, so this may come in handy in CSS. But where it really comes in handy is when we're using JavaScript, okay? Because now we can select the elements for our inputs in order to get the values that the user inputted out of them, okay? So here we are finding the input tag, the input element that has a name attribute with the value username, right? So that's the input that the user has added their username into. Here we're finding that, and then we're doing .val to get the value out of there. And we're storing that result in a variable username. Okay, so that's why this is particularly useful. Another new selector that we learned was this checked pseudo selector. And we learned about other pseudo selectors earlier in the course, like hover and active and visited, especially when it comes to links, right? Those are especially useful for links. This checked is especially useful for radio buttons and checkboxes. And this says, find all of the input tags that have a name attribute with the value pets, but not all of them, right? Only the ones that are currently checked by the user, right? So this is a pseudo class saying only the ones that are checked by the user. So we could style the ones that the user checked differently than the ones that the user has not checked or has not selected. Again, that's sort of useful, could be useful in CSS, but it's more useful as when we're using jQuery. And here what we're doing is we're finding all of the inputs with the name attribute pets that are checked, and we're seeing how many of those things were checked. Okay, so remember, pets is a checkbox, meaning that the user can select multiples of those. And here we want to see how many did they actually select. And we're storing that number in this variable. Okay, any questions about this? So a couple other form features that we discussed. One was the submit button. Pretty simple. It's just another input with a type submit. And then the value here is what we see on the button itself. Okay, so value here behaves a little bit differently than it does for other inputs. Here, this just means what do I see on the button. So normally what we think about, like for instance, in a button element, so a button HTML element, the text that you see on there would go in between open and close tag, right? And that's how we would expect this to be, but it's a little bit odd, and it puts the thing that you see on the button in that value attribute. Just the way it is. I didn't think of it. Okay, the other thing we mentioned were labels. And labels are how we show the user potentially, what this input is for. Okay, so sometimes we use placeholders within the input itself, but we also oftentimes include labels. Okay, and especially we include these if we're trying to make our site accessible to devices like screen readers and things of that nature. They're very important for that purpose. And we match this label to this input using this for attribute. And I misspoke last class when I said the before attribute was for the name. It was supposed to match the name. The for attribute is actually supposed to match the ID. Okay? So the for attribute here is saying this is for an input that has an ID username, which is this one right here. Yes?
If you use a label, you have to give an ID to the.
If you use it in this way, okay? There's another way you can use labels, which is like this, okay? And this is putting the input inside of the label. Okay, does everybody see this? So here, the label and the input are next to each other. The label ends here and the input begins here. You see that? Down here, the label starts here, the input starts here, and then the label closes after the input. So if you put the input within the label, which is an option, then you don't need to have the for or an ID. If the label is not inside, if the input is not inside of the label, then you must have a for and you must have an ID. And oftentimes the ID will just be the same as the name.
Is there a reason for that? Because based off of positioning, like you put the label right above the input, would it just automatically be?
You would think so, but imagine that your HTML is a little more complicated, and maybe your label is in maybe your form is in a table, right? And the label is in the first table cell, and the input itself is in the second table cell. So you're not guaranteed that they're going to be right next to each other. I mean, oftentimes they are, but you're not guaranteed it. And so, you know, it's not going to make any assumptions about where things are. It's going to rely on you to tell it what's next to it. Any other questions about this? All right, I'm going to plug in my computer real quick. It's about to die. All right, so we're going to turn back to the exercise we started last class. And the first thing we're going to look at is a real quick review of for loops, okay? Because this is a difficult concept. We've talked about it a number of times, but I want to go through it one more time. We talked about last class, one primary use case for a for loop is potentially creating HTML where it might be cumbersome to type it all ourselves, okay? And one place that we see that a lot is for selects, okay? And in the exercise we worked on last time, we added those select options manually. We typed them all in. We're just going to refactor this to do it using JavaScript in a for loop instead of typing them in manually, okay? And also, so I have starter code that basically left off where we were last class. So if you weren't here last class, you can download the starter code, and it will be exactly where we left off. And if you were here last class and you want to just continue working on the same code, that's totally cool too. So for those of you who want to start from the starter code, go ahead and sync the class repo. I'm going to open it in Finder. We're going to go into week 10, 18, and there's a starter code folder. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And go back into Documents, go into my named repository, create a new class 18 folder. Oh, I have caps lock on. That's fun. And then I'm going to, oops, not do that. And then just paste that starter code in there. And then drag Planetarium Loops, the project we're working on, down into Sublime Text. Okay. So a brief recap of what we did last class. So we're working here on this register.html page, which is the registration for Planetarium, say newsletter or whatever it is. And we went through and added a bunch of inputs to this form. So here we added a username input, and we added a label here. You'll notice that this is missing an ID because I did it wrong with last month. Here we have a password input, email address, Here we have a radio button that's asking the user, do you love space? Okay. Here we have check boxes for your favorite astronauts. And down here we have a select that is for selecting your favorite planet. Okay. And so here, this is what we're going to refactor from, instead of doing this manually and typing each one, we're going to use JavaScript to put these options in there instead. Okay? So I'm going to just erase those. I'm going to give this, well, actually, we have everything we need here, so I'm just going to leave it the way it is. Name planet. Okay, let's go into our JavaScript and look at where we left off there. So here we've got our JavaScript. We are waiting for the document to be ready, as we always do. And we're waiting for that registration form to have its submit event, right? Which is when that submit button is pressed. Okay? And when that happens, we're going to run this function process form. And what we talked about is this process form function, its job is going to be to validate that this user's input is good, right? And this is a very common website concern, right? We want to make sure that the input that our user is putting in is valid. And you'll see this all the time when you try to enter a form without filling out all the fields, say, you'll get like a red box and an error message that says, please, do this and this before you can submit the form. We see that all the time. And this is basically how that's done, right? So that's what we're going to be doing. But first, before we get there, up here, as soon as the document's ready, let's go ahead and create those options and put them into the page. So the first thing we're going to need to do that is create an array. And this array just needs to store the thing that changes between each option, okay? And the only thing that changes in each option is the name, planet. So we're going to create an array, and we do that using these square brackets. That creates an array. If we left it like this, that would be an empty array, an array with nothing in it. However, we're going to actually put the planet names in there. Oh, let me make the font a bit bigger. I just realized that the Hangout is probably filming my face. Okay. And we're back. Oops, where did Sublime go? All right, so the next thing we need to put in here is all of the planets as strings, right? So we'll start with Mercury, Venus, oops, Mars. Anybody remember the acronym that you learned to do the planets? It's like my very. Is that it? Oh, right. Very good. Okay, so Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Planet 9. And we separate each of these by putting a comma after it, and that's showing where one thing begins and where the next one starts, where one ends, where the next one begins. Right? So now we've created this array with 9 things inside of it. What's the index of the last thing in this array? Planet 9. What's the index of that? Remember, indexes are how we find things in an array. So what's the index of the last element in this array? 8. And why is that? Exactly. We start at 0. When we're counting in indexes, in arrays, we start at 0 and then count up from there. And so the last index is always going to be 1 less than the length of the array, or 1 less than the number of things in the array. Okay? So now what we need to do is we need to iterate over this array or loop through this array in order to create an option for each planet that's in this array. Okay? So let's do that. Let's create a for loop. We do that using the for keyword. Remember, there's 3 parts to a for loop. The first part tells us what to do before the loop starts. The second part tells us the condition under which we continue, right? The condition under which we keep going in the loop. And the last part tells us what do we do after each cycle of the loop, each repetition of the loop. Okay? So what are we going to do before? Well, generally what we do is we create some sort of variable to keep track of an index, or to keep track of the number of times we've gone through the loop. Here I'm going to call that I for index, common convention, but not necessary. The next thing we want to do is to define when this loop should terminate, right? When should it end? When should it stop repeating? Okay? And if we're looping through an array, right, if we're iterating over an array, we want to stop once we've gotten to the last thing in that array. Well, we just talked about how do we know we're at the last thing? It's when we're at the index that's 1 minus the number of things in the array, or 1 minus, or the number of things in the array minus 1, sorry. And that would be the length minus 1. And so here we'll say, as long as I is less than planet names dot length minus 1, keep going, right? So as long as I, the index, is less than the length minus 1 of our array, or the last index of that array, keep going, keep repeating. Okay? And after each repetition of this loop, we're just going to add 1 to our index so that we can keep going to the next thing in the array. Okay? And so this is the skeleton, after we add these curly braces, of a for loop. And remember, all the code that goes inside of the curly braces is what's repeated each time the loop goes. Yes?
Can I have more than one for loop on a page? Would you have to use different letters than I?
Yeah, that's a good question. So not necessarily, but it's generally a good idea not to use the same letter. However, there is this situation where you could have for loops inside of for loops. So we could have a for loop here that starts here, and there you would necessarily need to use a new name. But in general, it's just a good idea, just so you don't confuse yourself or anybody else, to use different letters, different variable names, if you have multiple for loops. Good question. Okay? So what do we need to do? Well, we need to construct some HTML given this planet's name. Okay? So we need to construct some HTML. Namely, we need to construct an option, a select option, as a string. And then we need to put that HTML inside of the select on the page. Okay? So a two-step process. First, we need to create the HTML as a string. The next thing we need to do is put that HTML into the DOM, or into the page. All right, so first thing I'll do is create a variable called option HTML in order to store the HTML for this option. And I'm just going to write what the HTML for an option looks like. And then I'm going to identify the places where I need to split it up and put something dynamic, okay? So I'll show you what I mean by that. So I know an option looks like this. An option has, opening option tag, it has a value equals some value. Then there's, some text there. And then it has a close tag. Okay. Right, so does everybody see this is the, basically the HTML for an option within a select. Okay. It has an open tag and a close tag, and it has, one attribute that's really important called the value, and that's the value that we'll see, or the value that we use to determine what the user selected. And then between the two, the open and the close tag, is some text that the user sees when they open that dropdown. Okay, so there it is. But this is incomplete, right? Because this right now doesn't have any value. So we have to add something in there. And we can do that by splitting it apart at the points where we need to add stuff. So we need to add something here, right? And we need to add some text there. Okay. Well, first of all, we need to get the text that we need to add in there. So I'm going to create another variable. This one I'm going to call planet name. Okay, remember my array is planet names. This variable is planet name singular because I'm just getting one planet out of that array. And that variable, in that variable, I'm going to store the value at I of planet names. Okay, so here I've got my planet names array. I'm accessing the value at I, right, which starts at 0, then goes to 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. until the loop ends, right? So I'm getting the planet out of there at that specific index, and I'm storing that in this variable planet name. So now I have this variable planet name, which is a string representing the current planet as we're going through this loop. So now I can split up this string here and add that planet name in the parts where it needs to be dynamic. And so I can split it up there. Oops. Oh, I was hitting caps lock. And I need to split it up here. Okay. So right now, I haven't really done much. I'm just squishing this string together with this string together with this string, which is exactly what I had before. But now that I've got it split up, I can add something else inside of it, which is the planet name. Yeah, question? Oh, sorry. Touch it. All right, so here, let's add, in between that, the planet name. Okay, so the first time this loop runs, I will be 0. We'll get the planet name Mercury, which is in the 0 index, and we'll store that in our planet name singular variable. Then when we do this, we're going to concatenate option value equals Mercury plus this, which closes our open tag. And then in between the two tags, we're going to add Mercury once again. And then we're going to add a closing option tag. And all of those things will be squished together into one string. And that string is going to be stored in this option HTML variable. Yes?
Now, I understand why you're using the pluses for what it does, but why couldn't you just like have planet name in there since it's not like you're putting two values together, it's just one.
So are you saying why couldn't I do this? Right, so the reason I can't do this is because the option would literally say planet name, right? It would literally say planet name, planet name, planet name, planet name, planet name. Every option would say planet name, because here this is a string, right? That's just text, it's not dynamic. Variables are dynamic, right? They can store anything within them. And so this variable, as it changes, is going to create new options that have new values. Any other questions about this? We could use a technique similar to this to generate whatever HTML we want to put in our page, right? Because all of HTML are just strings that we can put into our HTML into the page so we can see them. So not only can we do these options, but we could generate paragraphs or tables or whatever we wanted in JavaScript and put those into the page by building them like this. Actually, no more questions? We're good? Okay, so now we've constructed our HTML string. So the final step here is that we need to actually take that HTML string and put it into the page. Okay, because right now it's just hanging out in this variable. It's not actually visible yet. And so the final step here is we need to find that select where we want to put these inside, right? And then we need to actually put them in using jQuery. So the first step is going to be to find the select. So how does anybody propose that we find the select using jQuery? So let's look at the HTML. What we'll notice about our select, right, is we have a select that has a name, planet. Okay? Anybody know how we're going to find that using a CSS selector in jQuery? Any ideas? It's a new technique that we just learned. Yeah.
Using the name attribute.
Exactly. So we learned that we can select by attribute, right? Any attribute. And specifically here, we're interested in the name attribute. So we're looking for a select that has an attribute, right? We use square brackets for attributes. We're looking for a select that has an attribute name equal to planet. Okay? Select attribute with a name, or select tag that has a name attribute with a value planet, which is, in fact, this select right here. Okay, and then we're going to put some HTML in there. So we could do it this way with .html, but there's a problem here. And the problem is that .html replaces all of the HTML inside of there. So we would add Mercury, and that would look fine. But then when we'd add Venus, it would replace Mercury, and so on and so forth. So each time we went through this loop, it would be replacing everything that's inside of there, which is not what we want. What we want is to accumulate a list of options, right, one by one. And so to do that, instead of using .html, we're going to use .append, which means append some HTML inside of this select. And what HTML do we want to append? Well, we want to append our option. All right. So let's take a look at this and see if it worked the way we expected it. It's going to be a little hard to see because it's very small. And when I zoom in, my browser doesn't like it for some reason. But now you should see this little select that has each of the planets inside of it. Ah, yes, we were. That's a good find. There's no planet 9 here. So let's look again at our code. Ah, okay, yeah. So, if we see that it ended before we expected it to, then it's probably an issue with this, right? An issue with the condition under which we stop. Can anybody spot the mistake I made? Yeah. Yeah, so it should be less than or equal to, right? Because the last index is equal to planet name's length -1. Another way to put this that's maybe a little simpler is to just get rid of the -1 and saying it's less than the length, right? Because the last index is 1 less than the length, so it'll always be less than the length. So if we do that, we should now see Planet 9. Yay. Okay, let's take another look at the rest of the code here, and then I'm just going to turn it over to you guys to finish validating this form, okay? So here's what we've done so far. We've written some JavaScript at the very beginning of our process form that enables us to collect all of that user input, right? So here we're finding the input that has a name attribute username and getting the value out of it. And we're storing it in this username value. And we're doing the same for the password, the email address. We're doing this for love space. We're getting the one that's checked, the one the user selected. We're grabbing the value out of that. And then we're doing this for astronauts. We're just asking, how many astronauts did they select? And so we're getting all of the ones that they checked and getting the length of that, which remember length is telling you how many. And then finally we're getting the name of the planet that the user selected. Okay, so now we have all of their input. We've collected all of their input. And at the top of this JavaScript file, it tells us some requirements for validation, right? So the user must provide a username. And so at the end of last class, we implemented this conditional here to check to see if the username was equal to an empty string or was blank, in other words, right? If the username was blank, then we wanted to add some HTML to this error message, namely, please enter a username, to tell our user to enter a username. And then we would remove the class hide so that error message would show. So if we take a look back at the HTML, there's a div right here called error message, and it has this class hide, which is causing it to be hidden, right? So if there's a problem with their form, what we do is we add an error message, and we move that class hide so that the error message shows, and the user knows that they've made a mistake. Okay? So what we want to do now is to implement the rest of these 6 conditions. Okay? So start with number 2 and go all the way through number 6. Just making sure that the user has provided us with the information that we need. And it may require you to do some Googling in certain situations. So basically, after this if, right, we need to ask another question. So you might say else if some other condition, right? Put something there, and then if that's true, maybe we add a different error message. So this is for requirement 1 here. This bit is probably going to be for requirement 2, etc. It is. So, so your instinct is spot on. Anyway. You would expect that to be a function. These other things are functions. However, length is interesting in that it's just a property. It's not a property. It's not that. So this is going to give you an array of things that are checked. This is just a property. It's not a function. It's not something that's needed to call. It's just a thing that it is. So the parentheses are needed because that's how you call functions.
Yeah, because before she was saying.
There you go. So a hint for number 2, not only do arrays have lengths, but strings also have lengths. Okay? Strings also can have a length. And whereas in an array, a length means how many things are in this array. In a string, a length means how many characters are in the string of text. Oh, sure. So, 1, these two things should look essentially referring to the same element. This select that has a name attribute. So when it says name, in there name equals length. Just like it looks here. So here what we're doing first, we're saying, did the user, what is it specifically? Did the username to the string, is it 1? If the username is 1, then show the message.
There are string functions.
So for number 2, we can do a similar check. If the password is less than 8 characters,
So
the mean show
So that would be the much more advanced approach.
Okay.
Those are called regular expressions. They're pretty gnarly. I mean, it's very powerful, but they're, obviously it's not very reasonable either. There are string methods. So just do a search for like how to find a specific character in a string in JavaScript. That first one. So basically what will happen is when you take a string, so the string is set as this big character, this big thing, it's going to say does the word welcome what this function does is it will basically return the position of the word if it finds it. So that means that welcome is in position 13, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 12, 13. If the character doesn't exist in the string, then it returns a negative 1.
So then you're doing this add symbol, and then if our variable that we is equal to -1. Thank you. I don't know. I can voice it, I can't process it.
So what we're looking at last episode, so we have. Basically, like say it's not, say it's negative. It's negative. Message. So it comes back positive.
So basically, what we're trying to do is we're specific stats.
Yeah. There you go.
So we're just going to do that.
So the hint for number 3, not only can you check the length of a string, just like you can in an array, but also characters within a string have an index, just like things inside of an array have an index. And so we can check to see if a character is in a string by checking to see if that character is at some index in that string. So that may help you with some Google searching. You may want to search, does a string contain a character or something of that nature. Oh, right. I don't know.
Yeah,
Should.
It's like, it was running that sort of default.
So she needs to have it.
Yeah.
What's our next?
Having the no validate attribute. Yeah, but I should have time.
Yeah. How?
No validating.
I just thought it's actually. Okay. So you learned something there?
Yeah, I didn't know that either.
Power of Google.
Exactly. The power gets 205.
Yeah.
The power is there a reason why the text isn't showing up here?
So we have given them values. The values don't show up to the user. So in this case, we're going to be getting labels.
Wait, first, are we asking them for websites? First,
Um,
So,
So these are data.
No, so I mean, you can try console logging, but I'm fairly certain it's either checked. It's checked. But the high level return.
Here's a question.
Yeah.
You have like
Yeah,
some
so,
labels.
Jacob, do you wanna get back to say measure again? Do you wanna just talk
Oh,
about that?
yeah.
No validate access?
Sorry. Yeah, so some people's browsers may be attempting to validate the form by themselves because they're smart and new. And if that's the case, especially you might see this for the email input. If that's happening for you and you can't run your function because the browser is attempting to validate the form for you, you can add a no validate attribute there on the form, and it will tell the browser not to try to validate it by itself, okay? So add this no validate thing here if you're running into trouble with the browser saying, hey, that's not an email or something like that. Sorry, your question was?
Oh, I was.
Yeah, well, I was console log.
So I did, and,
Right, so in this case, the label should be yes or no. We need some other element that poses the question itself.
I'm saying you haven't submitted anything yet, so. So, right, so I'm saying go back to your.
Labels aren't self-correct.
Console.log.
oh, we lost space.
If you haven't submitted, it doesn't work, so it doesn't actually know whether it's your finding particular yet, so.
So,
If you haven't submitted anything yet, so go back to so.
yeah, because basically what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the first one is wrong, and then we'll check the second one. If that one's wrong, then we'll activate. Yeah, I mean, we could do them with this, but then like the quiz be weird because they all be trying to write this error messages.
So
We
try.
just upset, that's only one. Now, a couple things here. So here, we're checking to see if the package is right. So we're saying, if the username is blank, then write the yes.
Yeah, so you
So
can take.
here, we're checking the good
Just that one issue was obviously so.
Right, if the password's length is greater than you want to check the bad. Yeah. So typically what you would do is just. And the second thing is, yes. Yeah, so we're just gonna write a different error message. So remember, that's finding that data has the ID error message, and we're putting in this. But we also still need to unhide it. So, yeah, there's no way to only get visible text. So now you should be able to test.
No, because that's, so A is a string, so it's not going to evaluate that. It's not going to be able to do it.
Yeah, but.
So JavaScript wants to, body line that, right? So it makes.
So it looks like our page is refreshing. So I'm
So
gonna guess.
string can be used for, arithmetic, right? And that's just logic with math. Less than 8. What is supposed to be less than 8? What are we comparing? What are we comparing?
Try opening the business.
More specifically,
So,
see what I'm saying?
open up your console.
So one thing here, you're
Now,
saying,
taking their secret
that's just the username. That's just whatever the username strings. Now I would say, what is the length? How is which is not length? So how length? The same way you do with names and strings.
You probably need that. Yeah, you need your missing.
So worry about what size the problem
So this one here is closing this one. This one here needs to be closed here.
Okay. You're with your real
And then
family.
that one that you read, so it's closing.
We're basically saying, are you just give us space? Show and show. Just say like this in there.
Cool.
Say,
Huh?
yeah, so it's pretty.
All right, for anybody that's a bit stuck, I'm going to do the next two on the up here on the board, okay? So number 2 asks to check to see if the password must be at least 8 characters. Okay, so just like an array, I can actually see how many characters are in that string, that's password string, by using the .length. So I'm going to check to see if my password's length, the number of characters in my password, is less than 8, right? Because 8 is the minimum number of characters I need in order for it to be a valid password. So if the number of characters is less than 8, then just like I did up here, I'm going to add an error message. And instead of saying that, please enter a username, I'm going to say password must be at least 8 characters. Okay? And then for the third condition says that the user must provide an email address that contains an @ sign. Okay, so we're just going to attempt to see, is this a legit email address? And the way we're going to determine that is, does it have an @ sign? Now, that may be not the most sophisticated approach, but it's, it'll do for our purposes. So I'm going to add another condition here, and I'm going to say, what I want to do is check to see if this email address string contains the @ character. Okay, and the way I do that in JavaScript is like this. I can do email address dot index of. Okay, email address dot index of, and then in there I put the character or characters that I'm looking for. Okay, and what does this tell me? This tells me at what index does this @ sign occur in this string email address. Okay, so if my email address is jacob@FEWD22.com, the @ sign occurs at 0JACOB at the 5th index, right? Okay, because strings have indexes just like arrays. So if that were the email address, this would give me 5. Now, if it can't find an @ sign in the string at all, what it's going to say is -1. And that just means I couldn't find that character. It's not in the string. Okay? So if email address index of @ sign gives us -1, that means that this @ sign is not in the string. Okay? And the user didn't input a valid email address. Okay? So what we're going to do is say, if the index of that @ sign is -1, then we're going to add our error message. And here we're going to say, please provide a valid email address or something like that. Okay. So I put it like this. We could have also said, if it's less than 0, right, or something like that. You might see it done that way sometimes, but they mean the same thing. If this index of function gives me -1, which means I'm sorry I couldn't find that character, then we know that the user didn't put an @ sign in their email address input. Okay, so we're checking to see what is the index in that string of this character. And if it's not in there, it's going to say -1, not in there. And we're going to add an error message. All right? Well, let's keep going. So the user must love space. Okay, well for this, we use radio buttons, right? So we need to make sure that those radio buttons are well labeled. Currently they are not. So let's go ahead and add some labels for those radio buttons. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pose the question to the user. I'm going to do that in another element because the labels are for the individual inputs and not for the question itself. Okay, so I'm going to say, do you love space? And I'm just going to do that in a paragraph right above the inputs. And then I'm going to wrap each of these inputs in a label. The first one will say yes. And I'm just going to do some indentation here so we can see it a little better. And the second one will say no. And we know that the second one should say no because the value of the second one is no. Okay? And the value of the first one is yes. I need to close that label here. Okay. So here I've added some labels for my inputs, and right above the question, with the radio buttons, I said, do you love space? So the user knows what question they're answering. Okay? Everybody get this? So now that the user knows what question they're answering, we can process their input appropriately. And we're just not going to let them register unless they love space, because it would be a waste of their time and ours. So let's just not even worry about it. Okay. So here, back in our JavaScript, for our fourth condition, we're going to check to see if the value of the checked love space radio button was yes. Okay? If the value, right? If the value of the button that the user checked is yes, then we're good to go. If it's not, then we need to display an error message. So here we have love space, which is the value of the checked input that has a name attribute love space. Okay? So down here we're going to check in another condition if love space is not equal to yes. So if the user put anything but yes, we could check here to see if it said no, but that wouldn't account for if the user didn't answer at all, right? So here we just want to say if the user's input does not equal yes, then let's display an error message. And here we'll say only space lovers need apply.
Resetting it.
It said what?
Instead of getting the error, just like hit register
So that, okay, so the problem that Jessica's encountering is when she's inputting it now, it's just the form's resetting. Okay, so what that probably means, remember, this is how we get it to stop from refreshing. So what that probably means is there's some sort of JavaScript syntax error that's causing this not to actually be run. Okay, so there's probably another JavaScript syntax error somewhere that's causing this not to be run. So I would, in that situation, I would check the console, see if there's any red text, any syntax errors. Okay, so our next requirement here is the user must choose 2 favorite astronauts, or we'll say at least 2 favorite astronauts. So we already have gathered that information about the number of astronauts the user selected. Remember, those are check boxes, and we use this checked to get all of the ones that the user checked, and then we're seeing how many were there by using this dot length. Okay, so we already have the number of astronauts, and we want to see, has the user selected at least 2 astronauts? So here we'll do our 5th condition. We're going to check to see if our number of astronauts variable is greater than or equal to 2, right? And that's the minimum number. Oh, actually, we're checking the inverse, right? That would be if that would be a good thing. Here we're trying to see the bad thing, which is if it's less than 2. Here, in each of these, we're checking to see the bad condition, right? The condition under which we show an error message. So if the number of astronauts is less than 2, then we know that their form isn't valid, so we'll add an error message. Please choose at least 2 astronauts. Okay? And the final condition that we're going to check here is that the user must select a favorite planet. Okay? So this condition is very similar to our first condition. The user must enter a username. Really here, all we want to do is check that they've selected something, anything. Okay? So what we're going to do is just check to make sure it's not blank. Up here, we've gotten the value of that select that has the name planet. Well, that's the one that we filled in using our for loop at the beginning. So we've got the value that the user selected, and we just want to check to make sure that that's not blank. And we do that by checking to see if it's equal to an empty string, or if it's equal to blank. Yes?
Is it always going to be not blank though, because the first option is
Yeah, great point. I wondered if anybody would notice that. So when we first load our form, right, the Mercury is already selected because it's the first option. So we could work around that in a couple ways. Probably the easiest way would just be to add an option before it that's just empty. What's the other one? We could add an option in there that says, please select a planet. And here we could check to make sure that the value was not please select a planet, something like that. So let's do the first one. Over here in our HTML, I'm just going to add here a blank option. Okay, and remember, because we're appending all of the planets, this one will be fine. It'll stay there, and it'll be at the top of the list. So now the user really must drop down and select a planet inside of there.
you have to set up like name on top of it.
Exactly. So if you now refresh your page, you should see instead of Mercury being selected, that select box should be empty when you first load the page.
Sorry, I meant in the where you listed all the variable names.
Oh yeah.
Did you just put like a blank?
Oh here.
Through there? Yeah.
Yeah. So totally. I could have done this too. I could have done that as well.
Without changing the page.
Without changing the HTML, exactly, because this would create an option with a blank planet name. Totally, I could have absolutely done that. For me, I think it's a little clearer the other way because that blank string is not a planet name, right? And so it kind of, the semantics there are off. But yes, absolutely. Okay, so now back to it. We're checking to see if that planet, remember that planet input that the user selected is blank, meaning they didn't actually go in there and select their favorite planet. Then, once again, oh, I missed a jQuery sign there. Once again, we need to show an error message. And this time we'll say, please choose a favorite planet. Okay, let's go ahead and test this. Make sure they all work. I'll give you a second to make sure you're caught up. All right, so I'll refresh. Now we didn't add labels to these. We should do that, but we haven't done it yet. So we're just going to have to kind of guess at what's going on here. But if we try to register without doing anything, it's going to say, please enter a username. Okay, so I'll add a username. That's all I do. It's going to say, okay, your password must be at least 8 characters long. Let me try adding a short password. Oh, still too short, so I'm going to extend it to 8 characters. Good, but now it says, please provide a valid email address. So if I put just any old string in there, it's not going to like it still. But if I add an .com or whatever it is, good. Now it's saying, please choose at least 2 astronauts. And the reason for that is because this yes has already been selected. So if I select no there, only space lovers need apply. Okay, so I'll select yes. Please choose at least 2 astronauts. I'll select 3. Great. Please choose a favorite planet. Well, now nothing's happening. And that's because we haven't told it what to do if everything's right. Okay? So all we've done so far is tell it what to do if everything's wrong. So what do we do if everything's right? Well, first of all, I know it's right if none of these conditions are true, right? So I can end this conditional by doing else, right? Which means if none of those things are true, then do this. And in this case, this is, the success condition. And so the first thing I might do is, well, maybe that error message is showing. So if it is, we're just going to hide it by adding that hide class back. Now, what I'd do here, if this were a real web application, is maybe I would submit this form to my server, right? Submit this form to my backend so that the user could actually be registered. Okay. Well, we don't have a backend to work with today, so instead of doing that, we're just going to show the user a success message. It says, yay, everything is right. So if we look back at our HTML, you'll see at the bottom here, there's a div with an ID success message that has this hide class on it, just like the error message did. So we can use the same approach that we did to show the error message to show a success message. So I'm going to change this to the element that has the ID success message. And I'm going to say, yay, you're registered. Ah, look at that. So your uses an apostrophe. And since I'm using single quotes, that ended the string. And if I were to try to run this, it's going to throw syntax errors because it's going to try to find a variable called RE. So here where my text turns red, that all of a sudden says, hey, JavaScript, look for a variable named RE. Well, there is nothing named RE, and so that's going to cause a syntax error. So in order to fix this, I could do a number of things. I could use double quotes on the outside instead of single quotes, or I could escape this using a /. So that's called escaping a character. And that says, don't read this as if it's a single quote. Read it as if it's part of the string. Okay? All right, so I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to try to submit it one more time with everything correct, and we'll see if we can get our success message. So Jacob, my password is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, like everybody. I'll say, yeah, row space. I'm going to select 3 astronauts, and I'm going to pick my favorite planet. And now when I register, yay, you registered. Sweet. And this is how form validation works. Maybe it's slightly more sophisticated than this at times. You can imagine, like, just because a string has an @ sign in it doesn't necessarily mean it's a valid email address. So maybe there's a more complicated check that we could do there. But in the at the root of it, this is what form validation looks like. Okay, we've gone a little long, so let's take a break, and then we'll come back and get into some new stuff. Yeah.
The hide class, it's not in the CSS or anything like that. So is that just like a sort of function that just like
No. No. What? So you know that? Look at the HTML. Okay. So we're including our CSS file. Are we including any other CSS thing?
Bootstrap?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the hide class is a utility class in Bootstrap that just hides things.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
Thanks. No problem.
Still saying
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I was having. I set mine up to display an alert window.
Nice. Well done. I'm sure your users will love that.
I know, right? Here's a question.
Yeah.
When you're going through your form, the way you have it, if you entered more than one thing wrong, it would only show the last thing you did wrong.
Yeah.
How would you get it? I would just be going around that way, just having it handle.
Sure.
What's another way to do that?
Well, so that's really a user experience question. But one way you could do it is you could say change the border of all of the inputs that have an error to a red color,
Oh, okay.
something like that. Or maybe you could display the errors right next to the
Right above
inputs that are relevant. So instead of all at the top. or whatever. So yeah, there's lots of different ways you can do that. But yeah, that's more of an experience question. Say a technical.
Sorry.
Also, the other, I guess you figured this out, the other thing you have to do is instead of checking if, also, you have to do them all. If, so that's like,
Yeah,
because if else if says only one of these things.
yeah. So I have all my set up at work.
Very nice.
I was talking to Tracy today, so.
So because Kyle,
Yeah, so I have some to do about it.
we're going to do
I mean, it's different stuff, like you go to employees, stuff like, but it's all like. Stuff that let's say from each, but it has two projects. Little four, so we should be able to get that. But we have to split up. So I can't say 2 jobs and do it today.
Yeah, someone like that, too. Someone like Saturday.
Yeah,
Like, right.
Last year.
Yeah. Just like the top, that's also.
Yeah, no, that's.
So like, yeah, Tracy was like, yeah, use my stuff last year.
Right.
But the way that she said it was like.
So you're right to watch her.
Totally understand.
What was it?
Okay, you're changing all of these. Jesus. Yeah, and she came over.
Could I just ask you something?
Well,
Yeah, you can
this
do
is
that.
not what we expected. That's exactly what I thought. They wanted to tie you to what he did for this year. She was like, yeah. Right, and I was like, so, like, you see what the computer is, right? She was like, no, like, he should have changed this stuff to this. And I was like, yeah, exactly. So it was like, this communication, but she doesn't understand what she's wrong. So, like, so it's just one of those, like,
Is she gonna like oversee those?
So you'll notice I'm not really, I like that. So what jQuery does is it does it says go directly every form. Now there could be more than one form. So what jQuery does is actually it's okay. I'm starting a new one because I forgot I wanted to change something. But it won't let me delete the message.
say what?
Okay. Oh, is that the one with the side camera?
No. It just has music strung onto it.
Oh,
It's
cool.
hilarious.
Okay.
Music.
That's all right.
It's from ABC.
Okay. Welcome back. Sorry, I was making a last minute change. So I just posted a link in Slack in the general channel. And then once you click that link, it'll ask for a 6-digit code. And that's the last one I posted, not the first one I posted, if you see that. It's the 923902. Okay? And this is just a little quiz I put together. Basically, it asks questions from the whole course. And as a way to kind of review concepts from throughout the course, well, I want you to do this, and then we'll talk about the answers before we go on to the other stuff. All right, so I'm going to wait until I see that everybody's joined. No, it's random. I don't choose them. Oh, okay. The link is join .quizzes QUIZIZZ.com. And then once you're there, it's going to ask for a code, and that code is 923902.
Sorry, QUIZ.
IZZ. Quizzes. I don't know, I found it. It looked fun. So
Sorry, can you repeat?
the code is 923902. All right. Is anybody not in? Anybody not in the quiz? Okay. Paul,
What?
I see you.
I'm in there. That's myself. Avatars.
Okay. Good. All right, here we go. Get ready.
That's me.
You should see it start to count down. So fun. Yeah, some of the code formatting isn't the best, but I couldn't really work around that, unfortunately. So forgive the code formatting. Oh yeah, I forgot about the memes. Yeah, those are fun. It's not that serious. Not that serious. Yeah, I wish I could take credit for them, but I really can't. They're all part of the site. It is a pretty neat site, though. Cool tool.
Might make it 1,000.
I think it's related to like how quickly you answer.
Yeah, but it was super quick.
Well, not quick enough. If one of you two wins.
Yeah, I got it wrong too, and I disagree with the answer. Yeah. No, you're- we're gonna see Harris in this film.
This is awesome. I can see everybody's progress. It's great. It's hard to think of wrong answers. Paul, give me a break.
I'm just trying to get his head.
All right, I'll give you a couple more seconds to finish up, and then we're going to review all the answers together.
That's why I like started last night. What did you get at?
Oh.
All right, I'm going to go ahead. Most people are finished. I'm going to go ahead and end the game, and we're going to go and review through each of these questions. So if you scroll down on yours, you should be able to see all of the questions. And maybe, I don't know if it'll show you how many people got it right and wrong, but ooh, this is really hard to see on this background color. Let's see if I can fix that. I don't know if this will work or not, but nope. Okay, well, in any case, we'll go ahead and try to do it anyway. So this first question, what is the generic name for the highlighted section of this HTML element? This part here, anybody that got it right want to tell me what this is called? It's an attribute, okay? So this is an attribute. This is the ID attribute. Class is also an attribute, as is placeholder is an attribute we saw. Value is an attribute. Name is an attribute. All of those things that kind of modify an HTML tag, those are attributes, okay? And we can access them and update them using jQuery's.attr function, right? We've done that a number of times, and that stands for attribute, right? So these are attributes. Okay, what is the highlighted portion of the CSS rule here? It looks like most everybody got that, okay? That's the selector. That's telling us what elements are we targeting with the CSS rule. Okay, pretty straightforward. Now, what's this part called? Here. What's that called there? Anybody remember that? We don't refer to that one quite as often. That is a declaration. So that's a declaration, and all of these together are called a declaration block. And then the thing in its entirety is called a rule. Okay, so they all have names. The one we refer to the most is the selector, right? And that's because we use it not only in CSS, but we also use that when we are doing jQuery. Which of the following CSS selectors will win for this HTML? And it's not showing me the answers. That's not helpful. Oh, here we go. Right, so we have 4 different ways to select the same element here. So this is, we're selecting this element, this div with an ID my bio and a class error in bio. Okay, there are 4 different ways to select it here, either by its class name, by its tag name, by both of its class names, or by an ID inside of a class. Okay, and we know that the rules of specificity tell us that IDs are always more specific than classes. Okay, they also tell us more selectors is better than less selectors. Is more specific than less selectors. And so these 2 things both have IDs, but since this one has 2 selectors, it's going to be more specific. And in that case, that one will win. Okay, so remember all those rules of specificity. You know, div is tags are less specific than classes, are less specific than IDs. Okay, let's look at the next one. What method will we use to create a new repository with the same code as another repository? Well, this is what we do every time when we're doing a homework assignment, right? We take the homework repository that I've created and we fork it to create a version for ourselves that we can work on. Oh my gosh, that building is coming down. I mean, not in like a huge way, but there's certainly rubble coming off of it. Anyway, sorry, it shocked me. So a branch we learned was, you know, creating a place to work within a repository. So a branch is not a new repository, it's a place to work within a repository. Pushing and pulling are methods of syncing our code to and from from GitHub or the upstream repositories, right? So those are not creating a new one, those are just syncing, okay, pushing and pulling. Forking is how we create a new repository with the same code, and that's how we get started with our homework. So the next one was, what is the name for space created outside of the HTML's elements box, right? So we learned about the box model and how every HTML element is in itself a box, okay? And that box has space inside, it has a border, and then it has space outside. The name for that space outside is called margin, okay? Space inside is called padding. Gutter is a word from design. It's not really applicable. Man, this is really distracting. Number 6, when using floats to make layouts in CSS, how do we best solve the collapsing parent problem, okay? So the method we use in this class is to use clearfix on the parent element, okay? So this is the problem where if I'm an HTML element and I have all floated children, all of my children are floated, I will collapse it onto myself, right? And so using a clearfix around the floated elements will cause my parent to contain me and thus not causing my layouts to break. So I use Flexbox in there as kind of a jest because, you know, Flexbox, as I may have mentioned, is sort of a future way of doing layouts that was designed specifically for layout. It doesn't have all of the quirks of floats, but it's not well supported in browsers yet, so it's kind of hard to use in a meaningful way. But the question said if using floats, so that isn't about it. All right. Why do many developers use jQuery when writing JavaScript? Well, all of these things, right? It can easily find DOM elements using CSS selectors, right? That's a big bonus because at the very beginning of the class we saw, how do you find something more complicated, and that turned out to be several lines of code in order to find, say, a div that's deeply nested in the page. Using jQuery, it's as simple as using a CSS selector to target that thing. That's one reason. It also allows us to do some more easy HTML and CSS manipulation than without, right? We can do things as complicated as animations in very little code, right? So we saw the slide toggle and the slide up and down. That's an animation. That's a pretty sophisticated bit of code, and yet we can do it all in one line, right? And so that's one of the real benefits to jQuery. And finally, another reason we might use this is that they've solved all the hard problems of differences between browsers. And if you don't have to solve those problems, then don't, because they're hard. So all of the above is the right answer there. Okay, this one was tricky. What type is the value stored in the variable myVariable? Okay. Well, it kind of looks like a number, right? But this is in fact not a number because it has quotes around it, right? And quotes always mean a string, okay? So this is a string that looks like a number, and potentially we could parse it as a number using parseInt, but it is not a number, it's a string here. It can't be, we can't use this to do arithmetic or anything of that nature because it is a string, it's text, okay? Integer is a type of number, it's not a value type unto itself, okay? As is float, those are types of numbers, but they're not types unto themselves. Booleans, remember, are true and false, so that definitely doesn't apply. The following function takes two pieces of input. What do we call inputs to a function? And the correct answer here was arguments. Okay? So when we're writing functions, we determine, do those functions need any input? And if they do, we add arguments to our function's definition. And that's saying here we have a function, it needs two pieces of input, number 1 and number 2. Those are arguments. Okay, what is not a stated goal of refactoring? I think Eric may beg to differ here. I heard.
No, I just misread it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, all right, it's cool. So what is not a stated goal of refactoring? Well, what we talked about is refactoring is taking functional code, right? Code that works and just making it better, making it more efficient, making it more readable, making it easier to maintain, reducing duplication that we've typed in there. So those are all things that we would do. One thing that is not a stated goal of refactoring is fixing bugs, right? That's debugging. That's something that we'd have to do well before we ever ship this thing, right? Refactoring can happen after we ship it. It already works. We're just making it better. Okay, and then what CSS feature allows us to target specific categories? Media queries, right? Media queries allow us to target different screen sizes, different screen orientations, different device types like screen versus print versus maybe a screen reader or something of that nature. We can target all of those things differently using the CSS feature called media queries. Okay, and we learned those are the @media, max width, something, something. Those are the media queries that we're talking about. Now, if we use something like Bootstrap, we don't have to write a lot of our own media queries because they've written a bunch for us. And we still may need to tweak a thing here and there, but they'll handle a bunch of that stuff for us. Okay, and then finally, what would we see in the console if we ran the following code? Again, apologies, it's not formatted great. So here we're saying if, true, and false. So what is the value of true and false? Anybody remember what the value of true and false? So as a reminder, and means both things have to be true in order for the entire thing to be true. So true and false, what would be the value of that statement? Exactly. In order for a statement to be true using and, things on either side have to be true. Okay? So here, true and false will together evaluate to false, because not both things are true. Here we're saying if false or false. In this case, or says if either thing is true, the whole thing is true. But here, neither thing is true. And so the entire statement evaluates to false. And thus, we wouldn't hit B. The next one says if false or true. And we know that or means if either thing is true, the entire thing is true. So here, there is a true on the right-hand side, thus the entire thing is true, and we would console log C. This final also would say if none of those things are true, do D, but we wouldn't get there because we've already done C. And thus, C was the right answer. All right, any questions about any of this stuff? It's kind of like a whirlwind review of all the different concepts we've done throughout this class. Okay, yeah. You have a question, Paul?
I do, but now I can't figure out. Come back to me.
Okay, sure, I'll come back to you. You got, okay, what's your question?
You talk about on that clear fix question why overflow auto was a choice when that does sort of work, and that jumped out to me right away, and that's why I picked it.
Yeah. So okay, so we talked about this briefly in a class. Overflow auto would work in most situations. It's an acceptable fix for the collapsing parent problem, which once again means when you have a parent that has all floated children, it will collapse onto itself and it can break your layout. So we could use overflow auto for that. The reason that we prefer clear fix is because overflow property, the CSS overflow property, has other goals, right? That overflow property can be used for other things. It could mean, should I scroll when things overflow? Should I hide overflow content? Things of that nature. And since it has that other purpose, we tend not to use it. The purpose of clear and clear fix is only to solve this problem. And so it's a much better solution, in my opinion. Yes?
What's happening when you have the background color and it's bleeding up to the top? It's not collapsing, but it's bleeding. Is that?
That is the collapsing margin problem. Okay? I think that's what you're talking about. And what that says is if the first child inside of an element is touching, if their borders are touching, then the child's margin will leak out of the parents. Okay? So that could be what you're talking about.
And that could be fixed by overflow.
That can be fixed with overflow auto.
On the parent.
On the parent, yes. Always on the parent for overflow auto. It could also be fixed by, say, putting an element in between the child with margin and the parent or something of that nature. Could also work. There may be other ways to fix it, but generally, if you don't want to change any HTML, just overflow auto will work in that situation. Any other questions? Okay, so the next couple of things we're going to talk about, basically, where do I start learning about these things, giving you an idea of what's out there rather than giving you, very specific information. And the reason for that is any of the topics that we're going to discuss in like the last hour and a half could take up an entire class, and in some situations could take up multiple weeks of a course. Okay, but really the idea here is that I want to paint a picture of what the entire front-end development landscape looks like, so that you have an idea of where to go from here. And the first thing that we're going to talk about is a concern that many of you have, and that's hosting. Okay, so this is a practical matter, and we will get into some detail here. And this is, how do I get my sites online? Everything we've done so far in this course, for the most part, has been, open the files on your computer, right-click and open in browser, and we can see it great on our browser, right? But if we want to send our friend a link that they can look at and see our website online, that's not going to work, right? We have to get our site hosted, okay? So what is it? So what hosting means is it's asking a server or servers to act as a host for your code. Okay? So take a server or servers to hold your code and serve them to users when they want to see it. All right. What is a server? Just get really basic. A server is just a computer. Okay. So this could be a server. Any computer could potentially be a server. What we mean when we say server is a computer, but also one that can be accessed on the internet. Okay. So you can imagine that my computer right here can't be accessed on the open internet. So you can't go out onto the internet and access my computer, thankfully, for me. However, these servers put themselves out on the internet and give themselves addresses such that they can be accessed by anybody who's on the internet. So that's really the only difference between a server and the computer in front of you, is that it's a computer that can be accessed on the internet. And the way it's accessed is through something called an IP address. Okay, you may have heard that before. An IP address, internet protocol address, and it's just a slew of numbers that refer to the machine. It tells any computer where to find that server on the internet.
So question on that, is the
Yeah.
IP address the code number of the hosting computer or related to the personal computer?
Right, so every computer does have an IP address. Some IP addresses are accessible on the open internet, and some are only accessible within a closed network, right? So when we're talking about servers, the IP address for the server has to be one that's open to the whole internet. And that's an IP address that the hosting company has given it. Okay, so that's the IP address of the server from the hosting company. Your computer does have an IP address, but it's not on the open internet. Nobody can access it, except for maybe people in this room. But I won't teach you that. Okay, any more questions so far? Yeah, and the other thing is, this is meant to be like sort of conversational. Like, I don't know exactly what everybody is interested in learning, and so I kind of threw together what I thought might be useful information. If there's any, if you want to go down one path and explore it further, feel free to ask a question and take us there, okay? So that's a disclaimer for all of the rest of the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. Okay, so types of hosting. These are categories that I invented. They're the way I categorize hosts, and I think it's pretty reasonable, but you might see other people refer to them a bit differently. So the categories are sort of from most complex to sort of least complex in some ways. So the first is called infrastructure as a service. That's what I call it. And this is offered by companies like Amazon Web Services, so AWS, DigitalOcean, and many others. And basically what this is they just give you a computer. They just give you a server, and they give you the IP address, and you can do and run whatever software you want to on that computer, okay? So it's a lot of power, a lot of flexibility, but you have to know how to manage a computer. You have to know how to run server software. You have to know how to make sure that it's up all the time, et cetera, et cetera. So very flexible. Ease of use is not as easy. Okay. Another category is what we call shared hosting. Okay, and this is what is offered by companies like GoDaddy, Bluehost, Blue Origin, InMotion Hosting, Gator or something. I mean, there are dozens of companies that offer this. Okay, and what this does is, okay, they don't give you a full computer. They give you a slice of a computer that you share with many other people, and they give you the ability to sort of manage that computer through a nice little user interface. The most common one that you'll see is something called cPanel, and that's just a little user interface that's used to manage this kind of shared hosting environment. These allow you to easily install most common software. So for instance, most of these come with one-click WordPress install, one-click Joomla install, Drupal install, et cetera, et cetera. any of those popular content management systems or other softwares, they'll come with that. It also generally gives you access to programming languages and databases and things of that nature. So it's a bit more restrictive than just having a computer and have at it, but with that comes the ability to more easily do some common tasks that you might be interested in. This kind of hosting is also cheaper. It's commoditized at this point, and you can get this for extremely cheap, especially if your site doesn't have many users or things of that nature. So there's another category of things called, I've called it cloud application hosting. This is from services like Heroku, Google App Engine, and basically these take, they take your code and they run it within their platform. So sometimes this is called like platform as a service or something like that. But they take your code, front and back end code, and they'll just run it for you. And you don't have to worry about how the computer works at all. They'll just take it and they'll run it on whatever computer they feel like, and you don't really care because you're not concerned about that. All you want to know is your app is up.
Is there some safety issues with
Um,
What is the more secure?
Yeah, so what is more secure? I would say this, in a lot of ways, is probably more secure than a shared host. And the reason is, when you have more control, like you do on a shared host, your versions of software can become out of date. And when they come out of date, security flaws are exposed. And that leaves the potential for those things to be hacked or to be accessed in a way that you don't want. Specifically, PHP is notoriously buggy as a language, and most websites that run on shared hosting are run in PHP. And as that language becomes out of date, these well-known security flaws are published. All of a sudden, any hacker that's worth his own weight can go and find those security flaws and easily exploit your site. Whereas things like this, they're keeping track of what versions are safe, and they're making sure it's up to date at all times. So, I mean, and that's not always a hard and fast rule, right? There's ways definitely to have a secure, safe, shared environment. But, if you're going to draw that comparison, that's where I would lean. That's a great question. Any other questions about this? So this one, of the ones we've seen so far, least flexible, but potentially the easiest to use. You don't have to get on the remote computer at all. You don't have to worry about what computer it's running on, or if that computer's alive. They'll take care of all that stuff for you.
And you would provide updates if you want.
Yeah, if you wanted to deploy new code, you would just say, hey, here's some new code, run this instead. And they would take it and they would run it for you. And there's tutorials on all these things, out there online, if you think you're interested in one of them. And then finally, there's application-specific hosting, okay? So in the previous application hosting, those are generally, they can take an application of many types. So they could take an application that's running, a PHP backend. They can take one that's running Ruby on the backend, which is another backend language. They can kind of do all those things. These are hosting options that are specific to one type of application. Okay, so for instance, WordPress.com is a way that you can host your WordPress sites. But they only host WordPress sites. That's all they do. So if your site is written in anything other than WordPress, you're out of luck here. So in a lot of ways, this is the easiest to use, but also the least flexible. And also, if you have a static website, which is what the sites that we have been developing are, static websites. They're just made up of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, right? If you have a static website, well, then GitHub Pages is a great application-specific host for you. Mostly because it's free, right? That's a great reason right there. So things to consider when deciding, how you're going to host your website or your application. What kind of site app do you want to host? If it's a WordPress site, then certainly WordPress.com is an option. Also, is any of those shared hosts, they all offer one-click WordPress installs. It's very easy. If you're running something more sophisticated, like an application that has a Ruby backend, say, that you wrote yourself, then you may need something like a Heroku or something of that nature, where it can run other software other than just WordPress. So if you are super sophisticated and you want to run several different types of software, and you want to run all kinds of fancy stuff that you couldn't get on, say, an application host, then you might need a computer. And in that case, you might go to something like infrastructure as a service, like DigitalOcean, where they say, here's a computer, have at it.
Are there some well-known examples?
Let me think about it.
What was the question?
Are there some well-known examples? I can give you examples of, if I know, companies, but also I can give you examples of what applications might be good. So for instance, any sort of software company, if they don't own their own servers, then they're going to be running on something like this, like Amazon Web Services. They need full control, okay? And they are software people, they write software, they know how to maintain software systems, they need that flexibility. Specifically, I believe Netflix uses AWS. Who else uses AWS? A bunch of people, tons of people. Everyone uses AWS to some degree. We don't. We own our own servers, but just saying. I use DigitalOcean in my personal life, outside of work. I have DigitalOcean servers, so if I ever want to experiment with software, I have a couple servers sitting there that I can go run stuff on. Specifically, I run a time series database, so I keep track of the temperature in a closet in my house for brewing beer, and it will send a temperature signal up to my DigitalOcean server to tell me what was the temperature like over time. So that's just a very versatile. You can run any kind of software on there that you want. You had a question? Okay, sorry. This kind of hosting, basically any small business that built a site in the last 10 years is probably using this. Okay, so Joe's diner or whatever it may be, or something like that. Typically, those kinds of sites are run on one of these shared hosts. If you're freelancing, oftentimes you'll set up something like this in order to host sites for your clients, especially small to medium-sized businesses. Cloud application hosting. So if you are, say, in the early stages of developing an application, you may not have a giant user base yet where you can justify doing something like AWS or something of that nature. You might do something like Heroku or Google App Engine. I can't think of anybody that I know that uses Heroku for a production website. I'm sure people do, but you guys know any? No? Yeah. Yeah, often this is kind of a stepping stone to something like a DigitalOcean or AWS where you have a full control over a server. This would be maybe where you test that in a way that's easy and doesn't take a lot of configuration. Google App Engine, we actually use Google App Engine at my company for when we're being attacked by either spammers or hackers who are DDoSing our website. We will deploy code to Google App Engine just to have extra machines running our code in the case that our main machines are compromised. So I think a lot of companies use it in that way as sort of an elastic bunch of servers that they can use if they need to. Some people use AWS the same way, but we use this because we don't want to have to maintain the servers ourselves. And finally, this, basically anytime you're looking at a documentation page for some technical project, like Bootstrap, for instance, or blanking, but any sort of technical documentation or website about a specific code repository, it's going to generally be on GitHub Pages. That's pretty much the de facto way to host that type of website. Similar to the shared hosting, a lot of small businesses use WordPress.com to host their sites. Yeah.
But something like Squarespace, the application specifically like lock you in, or so you use
Yeah, I don't have a lot of personal experience with Squarespace, but yes, I would kind of put it into that category. Squarespace is like a site builder, right? So it doesn't even require you to actually write any code yourself. I think they do have a developer platform where you can write code. I'm not that familiar with it. Yeah.
There are actually companies that popped up that exclusively code for Squarespace.
Yeah.
So you can start a Squarespace and hire a developer and write CSS for your website.
Yeah, with that said, Squarespace is a very sort of walled garden, right? So you have to write code that's very specific to Squarespace, and kind of boxing yourself in that way. Is there a question? Go ahead.
I was just gonna say the other thing about Squarespace, because I was looking into it for my personal portfolio and stuff like that. So the other thing about Squarespace is if you have a domain name like your name.com, you can only put their website on that domain. You can't have a TP access into it. It's just sort of all.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I was not aware of that. Yeah, there are a lot of, I guess that kind of like site builder hosting, which is, you don't necessarily write the code yourself. You use some sort of user interface to build a website. So Squarespace, Wix, any others? There's probably a few others. Yeah, yeah. There are lots of those, and those, you may or may not be able to write code. And when you do, it's got to be very much in the style that they expect it to be. So, yeah, they do have nice sites. Yeah, they do have nice sites. And also, Squarespace is very good about keeping your site up, even if they're being attacked. Yeah.
Just a question on the meaning of static pages. So that means that pages that all its functionality are calculated in CSS and JavaScript.
Precisely. Exactly. So what I mean when I say static website, what I mean is that the whole site consists of just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, i.e. all the sites we've made so far in this class. Okay? The opposite of a static site is what we call a dynamic site. And that site that has some sort of backend that allows the content on the page to change. Okay? So every time we load our planetarium site, it's going to look exactly the same. On a dynamic site, maybe when we came back tomorrow, it would have some new content that the owner of the site had added, right? That would be a dynamic site. And there's more involved than just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in that situation, generally.
So, I assume there are ways to connect this content to the backend.
Yeah. Maybe not easily in GitHub Pages. I mean, you maybe could do it, but it's not really intended for that use. But there are definitely ways in all these other methods of making those sites dynamic. Okay. So so we were going through this list. Other questions you might ask. Do you anticipate that the site or app might grow? If your site is relatively sparsely visited now, but you think a couple months down the line it may be visited by hundreds of thousands of people, that you may need to be consider, how do I choose an option that will allow me to grow into a bigger user base? A lot of these shared hosting plans come with bandwidth limits. Okay, so let's say you can have up to a gig of bandwidth a month or whatever it might be. And if you start to exceed that, they'll start charging you some exorbitant overage fees. So, those are things to consider. Do you anticipate the tech changing? So, are you throwing it onto a WordPress site now with the hopes of changing it later? If that's the case, then maybe choose something other than a WordPress.com where WordPress is your only option. I don't think that happens very often, but something to think about. How important is uptime? Okay, so when we say uptime, we mean is your site up all the time? Okay, Different hosts might have different reputations or different SLAs for their uptime. They may say like, this will be up 99% of the time, or we guarantee that the site will be up, say, 90% of the time. Right? If you have a site that's heavily visited, that's supporting some product, you want that uptime to be very high, 99.9 or something of that nature. What's your budget? That's a big consideration. Your shared hosting's cheap, but maybe less flexible or less reliable than you are requiring for your product. Okay? So it's all about trade-offs, right? Two big trade-offs: reliability versus price. And the other big trade-off, flexibility versus ease of use, right? So the infrastructure as a service, super flexible. Not especially easy to get up and running if you haven't managed a server before. WordPress.com, super easy to get up and running. But if you want to run anything other than WordPress.com, you're kind of out of luck. Okay, so it's all about these trade-offs and figuring out where your site or application falls. So a note on domain names, just because we haven't really touched on those. Domain names are actually separate from hosting altogether. So what I mean by a domain name is jacobfriedman.com, generalassem.ly, or whatever it might be. Those are all called domain names. And these are actually separate entities from hosting. A lot of times they'll be sold together as like a bundle, but they are different things. A domain name you buy from a registrar, and they will register you as the owner of that domain name. Okay? Only one person can own a domain name, and if that, if some domain that you want is already owned by somebody else, you either have to, buy it from them, which is a very difficult process, or you have to choose a new name. It's really your only options. And there are people who just like buy up domain names to sell them for higher prices. So there's a lot of domain name arbitrage that happens. So when you buy a domain name, you then have to tell it where to go. Okay? So if I bought jacobfriedman.com, I bought a hosting plan that gave me an IP address 1.1.1.1. I would say, point my domain name jacobfriedman.com to the IP address 1.1.1.1. And then when everybody went on the internet, Jacob Friedman would send them to my server and my site would show up. Okay? So those are actually two different things. They're not actually one and the same. Oftentimes they're sold together though, so it may not be so obvious. Any questions about that? Okay, so the next thing I wanted to do was use GitHub Pages to set up a website for your final project. I think since Wednesday is a lab dedicated to the final project, we'll push this off until the beginning of Wednesday's class. Because we're running kind of low on time and I want to get to the next bit of material and still give you all of Wednesday to work on your project. So we'll skip this and we'll do this on Wednesday. But what we're going to do is use GitHub Pages hosting to create a website for your final project so that you'll be able to show your friends, your family, and your classmates during the presentation. Okay, so on to the next thing. But before, do we want to do another break or should we just keep going? I always ask, but I think that's a bad strategy. Let's just do a very quick break, okay? Very quick break. Stretch your legs.
All right, next time.
And then we'll, sorry.
arbitrary so yes. So in other words, like to run, say, not without the whole, you just copy like this, this
else would
right? So you see, you just copy like this.
Yeah.
So,
I was just copying.
right, so the reason why I did this one is because password is not so what we password is. Also,
While we're waiting for people to come back, does anybody have any other questions about hosting that we can just like talk about? Is that helpful at all?
okay, so we get the same issue.
Cool.
I would say, so after you take this out,
These two are not.
so
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. So I want to leave some time at the very end for anybody to ask questions and kind of steer the conversation. So what I wanted to talk about now, because this is really like the last time I'm going to be up here chatting at you. On Wednesday we're going to do our lab for the whole class so that you can work on your final projects with full access to us, and then on Mondays presentations. So this is my last opportunity to get up on my podium and sort of, yeah. So here I'm going. So what comes next? We've had this class, we've learned a bunch of skills. What do we do with it from here? And the answer is it depends, right? It depends. There is a bunch of different directions you could go with these skills. It really depends on what are your goals for front-end web development, and where do you want to take this? Okay. And I said this at the beginning, but I've kind of put this into a few categories that are probably oversimplified. Really, it's like a spectrum of possibility. And I kind of packaged it this way. There's really no restriction saying you have to go one way or the other. At this point in my career, I've gone down each of these in some way or another. So there's nothing boxing you in. I just kind of want to say, if you're picking the next things to do, here's what I'd recommend based on your goals. So first of all, here's some things that may benefit each of you, no matter where you go from here. Okay? So things that you might want to look into, no matter where you go from here. And the rest of this, I believe the rest of this presentation has links and things to more resources that can sort of guide you where to go. So the first thing, we've talked about Bootstrap some, but it would be really advantageous to you to master some CSS framework. So not only to be familiar with it, but to really know how to use it to speed up your development time. Because that's really what it's all about. It's not necessarily that we don't know how to write our own CSS. It's that something like Bootstrap or Foundation or something of that nature really speeds up the development time and makes you more productive. You can learn how to do all those things without a framework and write your own framework, say, or something simplified, if that's the route you want to take. But it's some way you need to have some way of speeding up your CSS writing. Another thing you might want to learn about, get some familiarity with, is HTTP. Okay, so HTTP, that's the thing that you see at the beginning of every URL. That's actually the means of communication from a browser to a server. Okay. So when you type it up there, you're asking a server to give you some HTML page, right? That's what you're asking a server to do using HTTP. It stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and hypertext is HTML. So it's HTML Transfer Protocol, right? And so this is a means of communication between server and browser. Now, you don't need to get in there and know how it works on a very low level, but having familiarity with how it works and the basic concepts surrounding HTTP would be very beneficial to any developer. And here's sort of a diagram, right? From the browser, we make a request, and then the server returns a response. Another thing that you might want to get familiar with, especially if you're using like a shared hosting environment, is something called FTP, which is File Transfer Protocol. This is how you upload or download files to a server. So if I have a shared host and I want to upload the code for my site, I could use something like FTP in order to get my files onto that server. This is a program that many people use to do FTP called FileZilla. There's probably other ones, but that's a popular one. All right, let's look at some more stuff. So we've done some Git and GitHub stuff, but it would be beneficial for you to become even more familiar with it. Almost every tech company, especially every tech company, but anybody who's managing code in some way is going to use Git or GitHub probably. It's the most popular way to control source code, to collaborate on code, So if you're going to continue learning anything, definitely make sure you're polished on your Git and GitHub knowledge. So definitely spend some time there. The link here is a really great tutorial on how to get more familiar with Git. And remember the difference between Git and GitHub. Git is the software for controlling source code, right, that we use. But GitHub is the website that most commonly runs that software, that we use for that software. There are others like Bitbucket, GitLab, etc. But GitHub is the most popular. But they all use Git. Another thing you might be interested in is something we call a CSS preprocessor. Okay? And all that means, and here's the two most popular, Sass and Less. I always just say learn Sass because it's kind of becoming the de facto CSS preprocessor. Bootstrap used to use Less, and in the new version of Bootstrap, it's going to be all Sass because it's becoming sort of the favorite child. But all CSS preprocessor does is it takes CSS, which is a very declarative language, right? It's just you give it a selector and you say what styles it needs. It turns it into something more like a programming language is. It gives you features like variables, things like sort of like functions, and other utilities like that make it easier to write complex CSS. So here, for instance, is what some Sass code looks like. So up here, we're defining two variables. This one called font stack, this one called primary color. And then within our CSS rules, we can refer to those variables rather than putting the actual colors. So you can imagine we could define like our primary color as a variable, and then instead of having to remember that hex code and type it in everywhere, we could just type in primary color every time we wanted to use it. And so there's some real advantages to using something like Sass to write CSS. Now, important to note, Sass by itself won't run in a browser. The browser doesn't know how to read Sass. So you have to run a program that turns Sass into CSS. And that's something that comes along with learning Sass, is learning how to run that program to turn a Sass file into CSS. Yes? Yeah, probably is. It's probably a node, which I'll talk about in a little bit, a program that is JavaScript running on a computer, on a server. Okay, so now for my oversimplification. The way I see it, there are basically, kind of from here, two paths you might take. Okay, and again, it's a spectrum. I don't want to box you in. I just want to give you some resources if you definitely see yourself in one of these categories. The first set of skills I call the freelancer/agency developer skills. Okay, so these are skills that are very helpful for anybody who's working on, one site at a time, kind of maybe a medium, small size business, and maybe even a large size business. But you're doing it in a way that you're building sites that by themselves are not incredibly novel. They have a certain look and feel, but no like application functionality, say. Okay, and the second type of set of skills was what I'd call the web application developer skills. So that's the set of skills for people who are wanting to build things like dashboards, like like Facebook or like Gmail or applications of that nature, where it's a really sophisticated application running within the browser. Okay, so this is how I've decided to categorize the skills. So for this first set of skills, the Freelash or agency developer skills, well, the next thing you might want to look at, or one of the first things you might want to look at, is something called a CMS, Content Management System. Okay, so what this does is it takes your static files, your static HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and turns it into a dynamic website. Okay? So a blog, for instance, is a dynamic website, right? There's content in there that's changing on a day-to-day basis. It's dynamic content. This, something like a content management system, allows a user to manage that content on the site without you having to change the HTML and CSS. Okay? So obviously the most popular one is WordPress, but there are many others. Yeah, that's a good question. So yes, you will have to write code, which brings me to my next point, PHP. Okay, so most of the popular content management systems, those that I mentioned there, are in PHP. Okay, and PHP is a back-end language, whereas JavaScript is a front-end language. Now, you don't have to be a PHP expert to develop WordPress themes, but you do have to have some familiarity with it. Okay. PHP, its name means, and I don't know why the order got all messed up, the name actually means hypertext preprocessor. Okay. So what PHP is a language that's used to generate HTML. So right now, we type all of our HTML manually. PHP is a language that's used to generate HTML dynamically. That's really its role. That's why the language was developed. And WordPress uses this to turn your static HTML into dynamic web pages. Okay. So here, for instance, is something like we might have written thus far, right? Just an HTML page, nothing special going on here. This is what it might look like in PHP. Now this is sort of pseudocode, so don't get hung up on syntax or anything. But this is what it might look like. So we've taken out those things that are static, that text that's static, and we've put something dynamic, right? Some variable is what this is. And you'll notice if you start learning another language that there are a lot of similarities between JavaScript and other languages. There are some things like variables that exist in every language that you encounter. Okay? So in effect, what we've done here is we've used PHP to take that static HTML and turn it something more like a template. Okay? So that HTML now, instead of being our web page, is a template for our web page. And the PHP is used to dynamically fill in the gaps, right? Fill in the blanks in that template. And that's how, that's how MySQL works. WordPress works. Sorry, I was looking at the next slide. The next thing you may want to get familiar with if you're going on this route is a database called MySQL. Okay? And so MySQL is where WordPress and other CMSs store that dynamic content. Okay? So a database is a piece of software whose job it is to store information, to store data, right? And in a CMS, a database stores the content itself. So if I write a blog post into my WordPress, that WordPress site takes that content, stores it in MySQL, and when somebody comes to my website, it finds it in MySQL, it fills it into the template, and now I've got a web page. Okay. So again, you don't need to be a MySQL expert, certainly, to be a WordPress developer, but some familiarity with how MySQL works and how SQL relational databases work in general is going to be beneficial. I hope they're okay. It sounded bad. Another sort of like peripheral skill to this type of work is something called SEO, search engine optimization. And you know, SEO basically means how do we build sites that search engines like, that search engines will promote to better results, you know, front page results. So there are a lot of things that go into this. There are using good titles. They're using good meta keywords. There's like how you link to and from pages is important. The words that you actually use in your content is important. So, you know, this is a real field of study, and you know, it's difficult because Google constantly changes how they treat web pages and what they think is important. So it's definitely a good thing to know, at least have some familiarity with. Okay, so that's one path. And obviously, you know, in this route, you're going to be more focused, I would say, more focused on things like HTML and CSS and making the sites, you know, aesthetically pleasing and looking good than you would be on getting very advanced in JavaScript, right? Because, you know, we imagine there may be some interactive functionality here, but it's not going to be much more than what we've learned in this class, right? Wait for some user input and respond in some way that's appropriate. You know, most of these sites are going to kind of have that type of interactivity and probably not too much else, but maybe a little bit more, and so that would be useful. Okay, so let's go down this other path here. So web application developer skills. Okay, so this is, you know, for building things, you know, like if you wanted to build a social network, say, or a game, or a dashboard where you display, you know, business metrics in real time, or a financial trading platform where you can, you know, buy and sell stocks, etc. That kind of thing, where it's a very sophisticated application and not just a content site. That's going to be sort of a different set of skills. Okay, and the first thing you want to do here is learn more JavaScript. Okay, so we've kind of done like JavaScript for beginners is probably where we've gotten to in this class. There is a lot more that you could potentially learn. Here are just a few things that you might want to learn next. One is a value type in JavaScript called objects. So we've talked about how arrays were lists of values. Well, a object is a way to look up values by some key. It's just another value type. It's very common in JavaScript, especially as you get to more complex JavaScript. Ajax is a method of communication to the browser. To the server. So if we want to get data, you know, after our page is loaded, if we want to get new data onto our page, say we want to refresh our news feed every 10 seconds or something like that, we would use something like Ajax to go ask the server for new data. Okay, so this is a method of communicating with the server. You also might be interested in learning, like, how do we integrate with other services? Like, how do I integrate with Facebook in order to allow social sign-in? Or, you know, how do I integrate with Twitter to pull down my news feed and show it somewhere, something like that. So that may be a skill that we want as well if we go down this road. Another thing that we probably want to know, you know, once we've gotten some more advanced JavaScript skills, is we probably want to learn or at least get familiar with a JavaScript framework. Okay, so Bootstrap is a framework for CSS and for, you know, layouts and aesthetic sites. JavaScript frameworks are for building complex applications. Okay, well, JavaScript, remember, was a language that was written in 10 days. It wasn't really intended to be used for big, complex applications like it has been in the past few years. JavaScript frameworks such as React, Angular, which are the two most popular, and then there's a bunch of others, many others, but those top two are definitely the most popular. Gives you some structure to help you build applications that aren't super buggy or that don't take a whole lot of time to write. React was originally developed at Facebook, taken on a life of its own. Angular is originally developed at Google. Also taken on a life of its own. Another thing that you're going to want to learn if you go this web application developer path is what we might call build tools. Okay, so there are several different categories of these. The first one is something called NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager. Right? So NPM is a piece of software that allows you to manage software dependencies. Okay, so most of the code that we write so far is dependent on jQuery, right? Most of our code that we write needs jQuery in order to work. We would call that code dependent on jQuery. We would call jQuery a dependency of our code. As you write more and more complex applications, you may pull in more and more open source projects as dependencies. And once you keep doing this, you're going to need a way to manage those dependencies, and NPM provides a way to manage those dependencies in a way that's sane. Now, there's other software for packaging, okay? So the most popular is Webpack and Browserify. Now, all of the sites that we built so far have generally been a single JavaScript file, right? Like index.js. Let me show you. Let me see if I have something. This is not a perfect example, but I will give you some idea. So, okay, this is not a great example, but a web application, when it's all said and done, is going to be made up not of one file, but probably hundreds, maybe thousands of files. And the reason we do this is because we like to write small, self-contained files that have one little job, and we call those things modules, right? And so we write those, and we keep them all in their own little file. At the end of the day, we need to take all of those little files and package them into a big file, probably. And we do that using some sort of packaging software like Webpack or like Browserify. So that takes a bunch of disparate modules and packages them into a single, what we might call, bundle of JavaScript code. Or CSS code. You could also write your CSS this way. The next set of tools is this grunt and gulp. These are called like build tools or build automation tools. Basically, these things take a bunch of steps involved in your build, and they automate it for you, or you tell it how to automate it. So, what do I mean by that? Well, here we said we already have two steps here. Maybe one might be find all the dependencies. Another might be package all of these things together. A third step might be test the code, make sure it all works the way we expect it to. So we might have lots of different steps. Grunt and gulp are a way to kind of automate those things so that we don't have to do them manually every time. And then finally, another type of build tool that we might use are some sort of testing framework. Here are some popular ones: Jasmine, Mocha, Jest. These are ways we can write in JavaScript to test our JavaScript and validate that it works the way we want it to. So right now we've been writing, looking in the browser, writing, looking in the browser. Well, maybe that's not sufficient. Maybe we want to be absolutely certain that it's working exactly the way we want to, and we would use something like this to write tests to validate that our assumptions about that code are true. Okay, another thing you might be interested in if you're going down this path is learning how to write JavaScript that doesn't run in a browser. JavaScript that runs on a server. And that's what we call Node. Okay, Node is a JavaScript server, and it can run code in JavaScript, on a server rather than in a browser. But there are some differences between how you write JavaScript for the browser and how you write JavaScript for the server. For instance, in the server, there's no HTML to interact with, so there's no DOM anymore. That aspect of the language is gone. So there are some differences. But the language very much looks and feels the same. So it can be a great way for a front-end developer to transition to the back-end. Yes.
Why do you need to write JavaScript
So, yeah, so for anything that needs to happen on the back end, for instance, saving something in a database, generating HTML, in kind of work like that, some language has to be running on the server. So that language in a WordPress site is going to be PHP. If I were to make my own site and I know JavaScript, I might choose to write that back in JavaScript. Okay? And that JavaScript can be saving things and reading things from databases. It might be generating HTML. It could be doing any number of things on the back end. That's a good question. Any other questions? All right, I'm gonna have to speed through the last stuff. So this kind of third option that I didn't highlight at the beginning is, well, maybe you want to take your skills here, and if you're really interested in JavaScript and programming and those sort of things, maybe you're interested in, being sort of a full stack developer, somebody who doesn't specialize in either front or back end, but can kind of move and do both. And if you think that applies to you, probably the next step for you would be to learn another language. So something like a Python, a Ruby, Java, PHP, one of these languages that runs on the back end would probably be a good next step. And how I look at this too is, in college I studied Latin, and after taking Latin, I came back to English with such a better appreciation of how the language worked. So learning your second language, not only will it be easier because you're already familiar with most of the concepts, the big concepts, but it'll also give you a better understanding of how your first language, JavaScript, worked. Because you'll see, similar concepts applied in a different syntax. It kind of just enlightens you as to, what are these common factors between programming languages. The more languages you know or learn, the better at recognizing those patterns you become. So, a full stack developer often lives in the terminal. So, when I'm at work, I very rarely will venture out into the user interface world. I'm, mostly working from the command line or the terminal. And so that's a good set of skills to have, if you want to work on the back end. There's a bunch of terminal tools. One's called SSH. That's a way to access remote computers. So if I'm a backend developer and my code's running remotely on some server, I occasionally might need to get on that server from my computer and see what's happening. And I can do that using this tool called SSH. Okay, I'm gonna keep speeding through. So, this is my highly biased view of what I think is exciting in front-end web development and things that, you might wanna stay tuned to. This is definitely not a comprehensive list, but it's the things that are top of mind for me. And they're kind of big things. So one, there are new versions of JavaScript being created right now. ES6 was technically ES 2015. It was started to be formalized last year. And then ES7 is starting to be formalized this year. Now, these versions of language don't really run in any browsers completely. However, you can write in these languages and use software like a SAS preprocessor software to turn it into CSS. You can do something similar for JavaScript where you can write it in ES6, ECMAScript 6, which is the new standard, and it can be compiled down to JavaScript that's compatible in all browsers. And this gives you all kinds of nice syntax that didn't necessarily exist in earlier versions of JavaScript. So this is a bit confusing, but this ECMAScript is actually what we call the JavaScript standard. That's what defines what the JavaScript language is. There are a bunch of new features coming to CSS. They're slowly being introduced to browsers. Some highlights: Flexbox obviously makes layouts a lot easier and a lot more fun. There are a bunch of new selectors. So we've talked about all kinds of selectors in this class. There are new ones that are coming to CSS in the near future. There's this function called calc in CSS that allows you to do simple arithmetic in CSS without having to do all this math on your own. You can just ask the browser to calculate it for you in future versions of CSS. Finally, a huge one, variables are coming to CSS proper. Whereas like now, if you want to use variables, you have to use something like Sass. Variables will soon be introduced to CSS proper as part of the language.
Where do you keep up with all of this?
Yeah, there are a bunch of things. I listen to a lot of podcasts about front-end development. There are a ton of blogs that you read. I follow like certain people on Twitter that I know and respect. Yeah, I mean, there are a whole bunch of methods. We'll compile a list of these things and post them in resources before the class ends. All right, a couple more things. I promise, sorry I'm running a little bit late, but I think this is important info, so I hope you can bear with me. Another cool thing that I'm super excited about is using front-end web development skills in non-traditional front-end web development environments. So what do I mean by that? Well, one is what we just talked about, like running JavaScript on a server. That's cool stuff. That allows you to run the same language in the browser as you do on the server. And that's one less thing you have to learn and to context switch between. That's pretty cool development. But maybe even cooler is you can use front-end web development technologies anymore to create native applications for mobile devices. And that's pretty huge because in the past, if you want to write a mobile application, you have to learn a whole new language, either Objective-C for iOS or Java for Android, now Swift for iOS. And you have to learn their whole environment and how the applications work, a new way to style things because it's very different from how we style things in the web. Well, now you can actually take these skills that you know from front-end web development and through things like something called React Native, which is a framework for writing mobile applications in Facebook's React framework. You can write mobile applications, native mobile applications using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And then finally, browsers are getting better. Slowly but surely, browsers are getting better, and they're converging on standards that are agreed upon. Historically, front-end web development's been so difficult because browsers do not have these, don't settle upon these standards very well. Recently, Microsoft released a new browser called Edge, and this is kind of a signal to the rest of the community that they want to play ball. They want to get up to speed with other browsers, and it's it's a good effort by them so far. Also, another huge development that may not be so obvious is most modern browsers, including Chrome, auto-update. So, in the past, if you have IE6 installed and you just never update it, you're going to be on IE6 forever, and you're eventually going to be very behind, right? Now with Chrome, it's just going to auto-update every time you restart that browser, and thus your browser will very rarely fall behind, which is a huge win for front-end web developers. Okay, once again, sorry for going over. Do look at this if you have a chance. This is a kind of what I talked about. They organize it a bit differently, but this is like, what does the web development landscape look like? And here's all these potential skills that you could learn and different paths you could go down to specialize in different things. So right now, we're about here. We're about here, okay? And we could go, any number of these places. You can even backtrack and go down this one into backend if you wanted. But this is, a pretty cool visual way to look at all the things that are available in front-end web development. And I lost my tab. All right, so a quick announcement. Sunday's the last day for homework, so please get in homework by Sunday. There will be no new homework this week. I'll have extended office hours this weekend again. I'm not sure 100% the time yet, but I will let you know before Sunday. Finally, please fill out this exit ticket. I'm so sorry for holding you over, but please do fill this out before you leave. And then have a good night. Yeah. There's a link to it in the slides. I'm not gonna. The URL is really long. It's like a bunch of random numbers. I'll post it in Slack. Yeah.
What class number is this?
This what? Oh, this is 18. Class 18.
Thank you.
Yep.